and I hear that there are a few people online, so welcome them as well. The only problem with the people online is we won't be able to give them any pie. So after our speakers, we will have some pie. And I'm going to speak, and then Rick's going to speak, and then we have Evan. So we have 3 speakers, and after we've spoken, we'll have a Q&A session. So you'll be able to ask questions, and we'll go from there. Anyway, my story is about the transition from not accepting the LGBTQ, I guess they're T+2 now, and having 2 members of my family who are members of that group. And so gradually over the years, as society changed its views, and I guess even back in the 80s, there were a lot of churches that really were not inclusive towards the LGBTQ. So my story starts back in the 1980s. My oldest daughter informed me that she was a lesbian and asked me to march in the Pride Parade. I told her I loved her very much, but I could not accept her lifestyle. I remember praying on it, and the Lord told me, give it time. However, I think my daughter felt rejected and looked for love and acceptance with people who accepted her lifestyle. My daughter and I still had a relationship, but it was not close, as it had been before she told me she was a lesbian. And in fact, she's had 2 marriages to other women and hasn't invited us to them. So it was obvious that she was hurting from our response to her wanting to, or to telling us that she was a lesbian. I did get to know her first wife, Nelva, and helped with the accounting of their cleaning business. I was not invited to her marriages, but recently she has joined me for some of the church services at St. James, because she sees St. James as a safe and accepting church. And by the way, we do get along well. It was never a case of not loving each other. So that was my first experience, I guess, with the LGBTQ. The next experience was in the millennium year, just after the year 2000, when my youngest daughter was sharing an apartment with a young woman who she had met at a Christian camp when she was a teenager. She announced to her mother and I that her and Sarah were in an intimate relationship. She said she thought she was bisexual. By then, we had gotten to know Sarah and accepted her as a daughter. Society had changed by then, and people with same-sex relationships were allowed to marry, and there was less of a stigma associated with their lifestyle. I have changed too. The message from Jesus has become true, that I should just give it time. Today, I am the chair of the Affirming Ministry Committee, leading the congregation of St. James to become an affirming church. Why am I involved in this ministry? If we are going to practice God's love, we have to provide an inclusive, safe place for all God's creatures, regardless of their color, race, or sexual orientation. I'll now turn it over to Rick.
Are we on? There we go. Thanks, Ray. And I want to echo Ray's welcome to our first ever Pi Day event. And momentarily I'll be introducing our honored guest this evening, my friend Evan. And I'll say more about Evan in a moment. And our theme for tonight, as Ray acknowledged, is stories of inclusion. And some of those are really stories of moving from exclusion to inclusion, as Ray was sharing his story. And mine is similar in terms of a movement from exclusion to inclusion. And I think stories like that can be helpful for people who are struggling with their own efforts to embrace inclusivity, to know that sometimes the people you see speaking in front of you, advocating very strongly, struggled themselves at some point, and I think that can be helpful to hear. For me, I was raised in what would be fair to describe as a homophobic household. I was raised by a father who was very homophobic and not shy about stating his views that queer people were living contrary to his understanding of God's will for humanity. And that was what I was taught as a kid. And so as a kid, I took it in because I didn't know any better, and I just absorbed the teaching that was presented to me, and I wasn't old enough to question it, and so I just took it as verbatim. We also lived at a time then where, sadly, there was, I would say, perhaps some intentional mixing of messages around confusing homosexuality and pedophilia. And when I was a kid, there were social views expressed that those were the same thing, which of course now we know they are not, but they were expressed as if they were the same thing when I was a child. And that is simply an expression of fear of people who are different and wanting to demonize people who are different. I had an unwanted and unwelcome experience as a child, repeatedly, from a male who expressed inappropriate interest in me. And in the climate of that day, that reinforced that confusion for me of linking pedophilia with homosexuality. And it took me a long time to process through that, to come to a space of understanding that they aren't the same thing. And as I started to question that, I was getting into my rebellious teenager phase, and at that point, I don't know if some of you may remember back in the 80s, there was a fashion trend whereby you would designate, if you were male, whether you were gay or straight by which ear you had pierced. I don't know if you remember that. And if I remember right, left was straight and right meant gay. It's so glad that that fashion trend is over and done with. I can't even remember if I've got that right. So I enjoyed being a little bit controversial as a teenager, so I had both ears pierced to be intentionally ambiguous, to confuse people and force them to scratch their head and wonder. I neglected to introduce my pronouns at the beginning, he, him. I am straight, I am cis. But I didn't mind being ambiguous in the 80s. Also in the 80s, it was the era of Boy George and Duran Duran and the new wave, new romantic movement, and I was heavily into all the makeup of that era. I know you guys remember that. Me and Estee Lauder were tight. So I enjoyed being ambiguous. But I was also starting at that point to question the teachings that I had been raised with as I was starting to meet in my life people who were queer, and realized, where's the harm in two people loving each other? That was the question that first started to unlock for me the wrong teachings that I had been raised with. Where is the harm in two people loving each other regardless of who those people are? Or two or more, as we may hear about later. And so I began to question where is the harm in expressing love? And eventually I ended up off to seminary. And the seminary that I was at in Vancouver, the Vancouver School of Theology, was it still is, very inclusive preaching seminary. And so I started to hear teaching that was affirming and inclusive and inviting and love-based instead of fear-based. And it really started to take hold. But more importantly, I started to meet classmates who were gay, who were called to ministry. And that was just shortly, I need to remind folks, I was a Presbyterian at the time. I was not in the United Church. The United Church had already been ordaining queer people since 1988, so it was just shortly before I ended up at seminary, but the Presbyterian Church was not. So I was in a denomination that did not practice inclusion. And so I was, but I was in a multi-denominational seminary, so I had United Church classmates. And there was one in particular who totally transformed my view. And I think if we are looking to soften hearts, one-on-one relationships are the most powerful way to soften hearts. Big teaching is important, but hearts change one at a time. And my classmate, Wally, big, gay Texan Wally, with the most incredible Southern Texas drawl you've ever heard, he was a better preacher than me. I prided myself on my academic and ministry accomplishments in seminary, but Wally was better at everything than I was. We were often in competition with each other for the academic awards, and he always beat me. He was a better preacher than me. He was a better pastor than me. He was a better scholar than me. In all of the skills necessary to do ministry, he was better than me. And that was the final transition point for me in breaking down my resistance to change, because I could not deny the legitimacy of his call to ministry. I stood there and I looked at him and I'm like, both of us claim to be called to ministry. You're gay, I'm straight, and you can do it better than I can. Who am I to question your call? Who am I to cast doubt on the validity of your call when you are so clearly better gifted at my call than I am? And Wally and I became very dear friends for the remainder of our time in seminary, and remain dear friends to this day. And I have shared with him that he is the one primarily responsible for the final softening of my heart. But at that point in my life and journey, I was a quiet supporter, not a loud advocate. And that changed when I got into my first congregation, which was a Presbyterian church in Burlington. And I had a member of the congregation, this is a difficult story to tell, I had a member of the congregation who came to me and was struggling with his sexual identity. He was not out as gay publicly, but he was out privately with me in our conversations. And I was working with him to reinforce and validate that he was authentically the person God had created him to be, that he was not flawed, that he was not devious, that he was not defective, that he was not sinful, that he was, in fact, living or trying to live into his authentic God-given identity. He was coming from a family that was not supportive of that, and that clash caused for him depression. So he went to his doctor and was referred to a psychologist for therapy for his depression. Regrettably, the psychiatrist that he was referred to was a believer in and a practitioner of conversion therapy, which is now illegal throughout this country. And he subjected this parishioner to a course of conversion therapy. I can't even call it therapy because it isn't. And so this poor person in my congregation, this poor man in my congregation, had one professional in one ear telling him that he was loved by God for who he was, gay or otherwise, just loved as the person that he was. And he had another professional in his other ear telling him that he was defective for who he was and that he was living contrary to God's design for his life. That tug of war in his head from two people who he respected for their professional views was irreconcilable for him, and he took his own life. And I had to preside at his funeral. And after that funeral was finished, I vowed I would never be quiet again. I vowed I would never be quiet again. And I moved from quiet supporter to loud advocate. And I was in a denomination where I could speak my mind, but I could not act on my conscience. If I were to preside at a same-sex wedding at that time in the Presbyterian Church, I would have been fired and I would have been defrocked. And figuratively, next door was a denomination where I could not only speak my mind, but I could act on my conscience. And so that was one of the two reasons that I then left the Presbyterian Church to come into the United Church, where I was far more in alignment with the beliefs and teachings of the predominant teachings of the denomination. All of that was decades before I learned that God had blessed me with not one, but two rainbow children. And to quote the line that I shared when my now daughter Leanne came out in our first Pride service a couple of years ago, that's when I moved from rainbow advocate to rainbow parent, and came to understand the word pride in a whole new way. I am proud to welcome and introduce my very good friend, Reverend Evan Swant-Smith from Westdale United Church. Correct me if I get the pronouns incorrect, but if I recall correctly, he, she, they. That's what I thought. He, she, they. And I'm going to leave it to you to choose how you wish to describe yourself this evening. But I've had the pleasure of knowing Evan online for a couple of years, and then once the pandemic started to wind down, we got to meet for the first time in person, and it was a great experience, and I count Evan as a treasured colleague and friend. So Evan, the floor is yours, my friend. Do you want this mic, or do you want to use the lectern? All right.
Let's begin by joining together in prayer. Gracious and loving Creator, we're so grateful for the opportunity to gather here together to share our vulnerabilities, to hear each other's stories, and to listen to your word as it speaks to our hearts, encouraging us to open ourselves up to your grace that flows into us and through us to the rest of the community. In Jesus' name, we thankfully pray. Amen. I just want to start with a scripture. I'm not going to preach, I promise. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. That's Psalm 139. There was a question about whether I wanted to speak here or down here. I will speak at a pulpit any opportunity that I get because it's an experience denied to most people that are like me. I want to start by introducing myself. So like Rick said, I'm Reverend Evan Swant-Smith. I'm serving at Westdale United here in Hamilton. I just spent 10 years in an outreach ministry in Toronto. I've been ordained by the United Church for a decade this May, which is a miracle. I previously had done my undergrad at U of T in sexual diversity studies and women's studies. And prior to being a member of the United Church of Canada, I was part of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Community of Christ. I want to start by saying I was glad that you brought up Boy George. Because often in queer community, we talk about our root. What was your root? My root was being 4 years old and asking my mom for the Boy George record, Color by Numbers. And I can remember being 4 years old and staring at the front of that album and loving Boy George and their very ironic name because I thought that they were a girl, because with their ribbon dreads and makeup, that was the only expression of femininity that I knew. And so I remember my mom very clearly one day saying, "Oh, Boy George isn't a girl." And I was like, whew. And my 4-year-old mind was blown. And next came the Mini Pops posters from the cereal boxes with all the boys in makeup. And I realized at a very young age that there were a lot of expectations that didn't hold up in this world. I'm not a huge fan of the 80s, to be honest, but I am grateful for growing up during that time. For me, growing up, I grew up in a fairly small town, Vanessa, Ontario, and then we moved to the big town of Brantford. I came of age in the early 90s at a time when teenagers were sad. Kurt Cobain had just died by suicide. Emo music was just becoming a thing, and the 90s were really a time, I think, when gender expression continued to get pushed further and further. It was also a time that the community was dealing with what had happened throughout the 80s with HIV/AIDS in the gay community. And so I can remember my first instances of hearing about queerness being stories of people dying. I remember the first representation I ever had of queerness on television being 2020, I think, and it was showing the effects of AIDS on gay men's bodies. And so coming out in the early 90s, my expectation was that I was gay and I would die, because that's what I saw everywhere. This was only reinforced by getting gay bashed repeatedly until I eventually left my home and became homeless on the streets of Toronto. I went to Toronto, not because my family kicked me out, but because I was gay bashed and it wasn't safe for me in my community anymore. And it was in Toronto that I found queer community. Despite being homeless, there was a huge amount of community. At that point, statistics were showing that over 50% of street kids in Toronto identified as LGBT. And so that's where I found my community. I was introduced to the gay village, to Church Street, and for the first time felt hopeful about my future. It was also around that time that my childhood church youth group became quite involved with American evangelical conferences. And so at 17, I was taken to Bridge the Gap, which was Niagara 98, held in Buffalo, New York, and it was put on by Youth for Christ, and as well as Campus Crusade for Christ. And this was my second time going to this conference. At the time, I was very evangelical, very involved in what you would imagine as American evangelical movements, despite living here in Canada. And I was out. I was very out at that point as being a lesbian. And it resulted in me getting tricked into going with my youth minister to a room in the stadium where they proceeded to lock the doors. And for almost 8 hours, I was trapped in a room with a group of adults, including members of Exodus International, which is the ex-gay movement in America. And they prayed for me. They told me I was going to hell. They told me that God wouldn't love me if I continued living the way that I was. And eventually, by some miracle, the door got unlocked and I managed to get out. And I ran out and I didn't return to the church for over 10 years. I only stepped foot in church once, and that was for my brother's baptism. When I did eventually come back around to Christianity, it was through a weird set of circumstances that I will spare you. But I came back in looking for the evangelical experience because that was what I was most comfortable with. And so I came back into the church and I sat and I listened to the minister week in, week out, different preachers, and all they talked about was hate. Everyone was living in sin, everyone was going to hell, and one day I heard God speak to me and say, "This isn't what I intended, go and preach love." And I was like, heck no. Nope, not me. And I talked to my friend Chris, who was in the United Church, and I said, "Chris, I think I've had a calling to ministry." And Chris said, "Great, you're exactly what the church needs." And 5 weeks later, I was at Emmanuel College on early admittance. I wasn't even a member of the United Church. I just knew that the United Church was the only place likely to take me. And so I finished my master's degree at Emmanuel. I worked at a couple of churches as a youth director during that time, and then I moved here to Hamilton for a year. And while I was living in Hamilton, I started church shopping, and I went to a number of churches. I didn't go to yours, or else obviously I just would have stayed here, and you'd all know me now. But I did shop around to quite a few churches and found one that I thought I liked, which will remain unnamed. It was really great, it had great music, great preaching, and I took my whole family the next week, and it turned out it was awful, and it was not my theology. But in between those 2 weeks, because I'm a little bit of a go-getter, I had applied for their youth ministry position and had an interview. So the day after I walked out of this church, grabbing my kids because I realized it wasn't a safe space, I went back and met with the minister who was gung-ho about hiring me as their youth director. And I explained to him that despite on paper everything looking fine, there might be one issue, which is that my partner was transgender, and though we appeared as a straight couple at the time, we were not. And he shifted uncomfortably in his seat at Tim Hortons for well over half an hour, talking to himself audibly, trying to figure out if I was living in sin or not, because we looked straight, but didn't identify as straight. Finally, he decided that we probably weren't living in sin, and I should be their youth minister, and I explained to him why his church would never be a safe space for any children, let alone mine, and left. I think that when I entered the United Church of Canada, I thought that the entire church was affirming. I saw the issues of The Observer, now Broadview magazine. I knew about the great work that the United Church had done, especially around 1988 and gay ordination and gay marriage, and I expected every congregation to be like that. At the time that I joined the United Church, which was 11 years ago, I think it was less than 1% of congregations were actually affirming, a number which thankfully has increased. But I think sometimes in the United Church, we get stuck in this mindset of we're affirming and everybody is welcome, and I think even within our affirming churches, that isn't always the case. I witnessed another time that people were excluded from the church at the vigil for the victims of Bruce McArthur, the serial murderer in Toronto. This was several years ago, and I went to Metropolitan United Church, and was asked to be part of a vigil that was multi-faith. We had, I want to say, it was either 9 or 17. It was a lot of people from different faith groups. And it was right as the bodies had been found. And I knew Bruce MacArthur, and I also knew some of his victims. And so I went to this vigil because I wanted to speak some hope into the world. I spoke the land acknowledgement, which is another issue. But I expected also to be ministered to. And what happened was that I sat and I listened to all of these faith leaders from different traditions who were either neutral or sex negative, speaking to a community of people whose brothers had been murdered as a result of being on a sex app. And so I walked into that church hoping to hear that God loved us, that God loved our community, that God loved my brothers that had been murdered, and I left feeling guilt about being a member of the community. And I walked out of this church and I saw men, especially from Toronto's leather community, who would never step foot in our churches, ever. And that was our one chance to show God's love, and none of us, including me, did that, and we failed. And I left that room and I thought to myself, if I can't live authentically as a minister, if I can't live authentically as a queer person, as a gender variant person, I don't have any business being in ministry. And so it was around that time that I came out about my family because I'm polyamorous. I live with my husband of 22 years and our partner of 7 years. We are raising 2 of our 3 children as well as one of our grandchildren. We have a farm in Niagara. My partner Jess is also a minister in the United Church, and my husband is a teacher in Toronto, a special ed teacher. We were out absolutely everywhere except for church. We were out at our places of employment. We were out in the community. Because it came to a point where I realized that it wasn't fair to keep asking our kids to lie about who their family was. It's a huge burden for a child to carry, and it was something that we felt like we had to do in order to be accepted. There's lots of theology that speaks towards the acceptance of polyamorous and non-monogamous relationships, and that's, you guys can have me back. I'll preach for a whole hour. But at the end of the day, I think it doesn't matter how we feel about sexual orientation or gender identity or relationship or family makeup. What's important is that we are called as Christians to show God's love, to show God's hospitality, to show God's presence in the world, and we fail. I fail. All of us in some way fail. And I know this because there are so many queer and trans people who are out there who are desperate for community, for belonging, to know that they are perfectly created and perfectly loved, and they would never step foot in a church because of the damage that has been done. I was pretty shocked being at Westdale, which is in Westdale. You guys know the neighborhood, I'm sure. We're right next to McMaster University, very hip, urban place. As I started reaching out on social media to find out that most of the queer people in our neighborhood did not know that there was a queer positive church in our community. And so when I think about Pi Day and I think about the things that Affirm United asks us to do, which is to be public, intentional, and explicit, I wonder how we're doing that. I wonder if rainbow flags are enough. I wonder if what we do within these walls is enough. Like I said, my background is in sexual diversity studies, and so I often look at the idea of queering spaces. I know that the word queer makes some people uncomfortable, but within our community, it was reclaimed in the 80s, well into the 90s, as a way of saying, yes, we are different, and it's fine. And so the idea of queering came out of queer theory in the 90s, and the idea was to be able to read literature and to look at places where heteronormativity or gender expression were reinforced, and to change it, to be able to queer it and say, but this isn't how it has to be. And so I think that the idea of queering our churches is something that benefits not only LGBTQ communities, but everybody. Because I think that our theology, our churches, our structures have held up these ideals of masculinity and femininity, of God as male, of marriage as being a certain way, of families as being a certain way. And it damages a lot of people, not just the LGBT community. And so what would it look like if we actually queered our spaces, if we looked at those things and said, no, we're going to do it different? I know that for me, I have felt welcome, for the most part, in the United Church. My family has been incredibly welcomed by the church. I know that when my kids go to Sunday school, they are safe and that their family will be affirmed. But I also think that it's not enough. There's something magical about being in a queer space as a Christian and being directly spoken to. I've been privileged enough for the last few years to be involved with the Queer Christian Fellowship Conference, which happens all over the States. And it's a conference mostly aimed at ex-evangelicals who have been damaged or traumatized by the church to come together and to worship and to heal and to attend workshops. But what's incredible is being able to watch people who have experienced the harm of the church affirming other people's goodness through God. So the ability to have a worship band where you know that the singer was kicked out of Hillsong for being a lesbian, and there she is singing to her own people, still faithful, still following Christ, still showing people God's love in the world. It's different. I think that there are lots of ways that our church is affirming, but perhaps we aren't as affirming as we could be. A good example of this is that there is a hymnal that the Hymn Society has put out. The Hymn Society is incredible. It's amazing. Their conference is actually in Montreal this summer. And they put out a resource called Songs for the Holy Other, and it's all LGBT affirming hymns. I'm just going to pull it up on my phone because I just want to read a couple of the lyrics. Because it wasn't until I started reading some of the lyrics to some of these hymns that I realized what I was missing in church, and even as a minister, what my congregation was missing. Let me just find one. I love this, but there's not a very good way to actually get to the right page. Perhaps part of queering our hymnals would be making them more accessible and inclusive. Just saying. Where is it? I mean, some of the hymn titles alone, quirky, queer, and wonderful. God of queer, transgressive spaces. Okay. So I'm actually going to sing this. I'm not much of a singer. Don't tell my congregation that I've done this. But I think that music can be so powerful. So this is called Sing a New World into Being. You'll know the tune. Sing a new world into being, sound a bold and hopeful theme. Find a tune for silent yearnings, lend your voice and dare to dream. Dream a church where all who worship find their lives and loves belong. I totally just skipped ahead. Anyways, you get the idea. There are these amazing songs. There are queer people who are rewriting hymns, who are taking the things that we love and not removing them, but transforming them into amazing opportunities to be inclusive. And so I think as a church, we need to look around us and look into our community and say, who is in our walls, but who is outside our walls, and how can we actually invite them in? Because I think often we talk about being a church and turning our ways outwards, but I think as a queer person, there's something so incredibly sacred and holy about actually being invited in, about being invited into a space, about reading things like your stained glass window. This is my beloved son. This is my beloved daughter. There are so many beloved children who are not included in our church, who are perfectly made, who are made in God's image, and who need this community. And so I'm grateful that you have let me come and share my story, and I would just encourage you to continue the journey that you're on. It's an incredible journey. Just the idea of being in affirming church is something that many churches will never realize. And so you're doing good. You are doing God's work. And I pray that God's grace and love and justice will be with you as you continue this. Amen.
So we have a bit of time before we have our P.I.E. So if there are any questions that people have or comments, Reverend Rick has the microphone, so if you put up your hand, he'll bring the microphone and you can ask your questions, whether it's of Evan or Reverend Rick or myself. Do we have any questions? No questions. Actually, listening to Evan speaking, I already mentioned that my youngest daughter is a part of the LGBTQ. But you know, she was raised in church. And she went, and I worked at a Christian camp, so all through her teen years, she was at a Christian camp all summer. And when she finished high school, she was really interested in doing something as part of, as a Christian, and she went to Tyndale College. And she didn't last a year there, but she came away and she was totally disgusted with what she had learned at Tyndale College. And I guess that's just an example of, you know, educational institutions that are supposed to teach their students and support their students and make them feel welcome. In Tyndale's case, they failed her, and the only time she's been to church since is if there's a wedding or a funeral.
Except here. Yeah. Yeah, and it's been an honor to have your daughter worshiping with us here over the last couple of months.
That's my oldest daughter.
Oh, you're old. I got them mixed up.
Not my youngest daughter.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I got them confused. First of all, Evan, thank you so much on behalf of the gathered folks here and those who are joining us online from, and we know, as far away as Portland, Oregon, right? Yes, who are joining us online. Thank you for your powerful words tonight. I've had the privilege and honor of hearing you speak online, seeing videos of you speaking. This is the first chance I've had to hear you in person, and you are even more potent in person than you are on a little screen. It's an honor to have you here. It's an honor to receive your honest, challenging story tonight. It's an honor to have your, your presence here in the room with us. Folks may, over the next few minutes, have questions that don't jump immediately to mind. So maybe what we can do is have some pie now. And if questions come to mind while you're munching on your pie, we're around. The three of us and the rest of our affirming team are here tonight. Feel free to grab us one-on-one or one on smaller, because as I said earlier, Hearts change not through not always through presentations, but most often through individual conversations. And so feel free to sidle up beside somebody and have a conversation while you're eating your pie if questions come to mind. You open to receiving questions while you're munching pie? Yeah. So. You're way too technologically cool. I got to get me one of those. All right. I saw our pie people jumping up a few minutes ago, so I'm going to guess that the pie is ready for us. Yeah. All right. So, not seeing them out there, do you want to check? Okay. I think our pie is ready. But yeah, if you've got, I'm stalling. Pie is ready. Okay. So feel free to grab some pie, bring it back in, munch away on it. And if you want to approach any of us with conversation and questions, please feel free to do so. Thank you for sharing your time with us tonight, and I hope you enjoy your pie. Is there any of Ruth's rhubarb pie amongst? There is? Oh.